What if the most meticulously constructed life, a fortress of wealth and power built to keep the past buried, could be shattered by a single accidental glance in a quiet restaurant? For 22 years, Eleanor Montgomery had lived in a gilded cage of grief, mourning a daughter who had vanished into the biting New England wind. Her son Julian, a titan of private equity whose name was a verb for corporate conquest, had encased his own heart in ice, believing control was the only antidote to pain. He had managed every variable, silenced every rumor, and paid for every secret to remain just that. But on a crisp October afternoon, inside the hushed, mahogany-paneled dining room of the Onyx Room, the universe stopped holding its breath. An old woman's hand, laden with heirloom diamonds, but trembling with a sudden, raw urgency, shot across a table laden with fine china. It seized the wrist of a young waitress, a girl who moved with the quiet efficiency of someone trying to be invisible. A whisper, sharp as shattered glass, cut through the low murmur of the city's elite. "You have my Lillian's eyes." And in that moment, as the billionaire's carefully ordered world spun off its axis, he crumpled to the floor, and a secret entombed for more than 2 decades began to claw its way toward the light. Clara Mayhew existed in a world of quiet details and precise movements. The gentle scrape of a fork against a plate, the specific shade of amber in a glass of aged whiskey, the subtle tension in a diner's shoulders that signaled he was ready for the check. These were the rhythms of her life, the quiet liturgy she performed daily within the hallowed walls of the Onyx Room, a sanctuary for Boston's old money and new titans. At 20, she was younger than most of the staff, but her composure and near photographic memory for patrons' preferences made her an invaluable asset. She was a ghost in a crisp black uniform, her presence felt but rarely seen, and that was exactly how she liked it. Invisibility was a form of peace. Her life outside these walls was a different kind of quiet. It was the quiet of a small, second-floor apartment filled with the scent of old paper and bookbinder's glue. It was the quiet of solitude, her only constant companion being the meticulous work she did in her spare hours, a passion that paid little but fed her soul. Clara restored things: brittle photographs, letters with faded ink, forgotten family Bibles with crumbling spines. She had a delicate touch and an uncanny patience, a skill honed during a childhood spent in a series of foster homes where the only history she had was the one she could find in books. She knew how to coax secrets from decaying things, how to read the stories left in the water stains and foxing on a forgotten page. It was a skill that felt more like a calling than a hobby. That Tuesday, the lunch service was a symphony of controlled chaos. Clara moved through it with an easy grace, her tray held high. She delivered a steak tartare to a judge at table 3, refilled the sparkling water for a tech mogul at table 5, and then turned her attention to table 12, the best corner booth, currently occupied by the Montgomerys. Even in her world of calculated anonymity, Clara knew the name. Julian Montgomery was a specter in the financial pages, a man whose acquisitions were spoken of in terms of military campaigns. His face, which seemed permanently carved into a mask of impatient intelligence, was a fixture on news channels. His mother, Eleanor, was the family's grand dame, a woman of formidable elegance whose public appearances were rare and whose private tragedy was the stuff of Boston legend. Clara approached the table, her smile small and professional. "May I offer you anything else, Mr. Montgomery?" "Ma'am?" Julian didn't look up from the tablet where stock tickers cascaded in green and red rivers. "We're fine," he clipped, his voice as sharp and cold as the ice in his water glass. It was Eleanor who looked up. Her eyes, the color of a winter sky, seemed to be looking at something 1,000 miles away. They drifted over Clara's face, a passing, disinterested glance, and then they snagged. The motion was so abrupt it was almost physical. The bustling restaurant noise, the clink of silver, the hum of conversation, it all receded into a dull roar. Eleanor Montgomery's gaze, no longer distant, sharpened with a shocking, predatory intensity that made the air in Clara's lungs turn to ice. The old woman leaned forward, her perfectly manicured fingers gripping the damask tablecloth. Her lips, painted a tasteful shade of rose, parted slightly. "Ma'am?" Clara asked, a nervous tremor in her voice. She was accustomed to being ignored, to being treated as part of the decor. She was not prepared for this forensic level of scrutiny. Julian finally tore his eyes from his screen, irritation etched into his features. "Mother, what is it? We have the call with the board at 2. But Eleanor didn't seem to hear him. Her focus was absolute, dissecting Clara's face feature by feature. She saw the way a lock of chestnut hair fell across her brow, the slight, stubborn set of her jaw, the almost invisible freckle just beside her right eyebrow. But it was the eyes that had stolen her breath. They were a complex hazel, a kaleidoscope of deep moss green, warm amber, and flecks of gold. They were eyes that seemed to hold a fierce, intelligent light, a defiant spark that Eleanor hadn't seen in 22 agonizing years. They were her daughter's eyes. Lillian, the name was a ghost, a puff of air so faint Clara wasn't sure she'd heard it at all. Before Clara could process the word, Eleanor's hand shot out. It was shockingly fast, her grip surprisingly strong as her cold fingers closed around Clara's wrist. The touch was like a jolt of static electricity, a connection that crackled in the space between them. "You," Eleanor whispered, her voice a ragged, trembling thing, vibrating with a terrifying fusion of disbelief and ferocious, desperate hope. "You have my Lillian's eyes." The statement was a grenade tossed into the placid atmosphere of the restaurant. Heads turned. Conversations faltered. Clara stood frozen, a silver coffee pot in her other hand, suddenly feeling as heavy as an anchor. She tried to pull her arm back, gently, but the old woman's grip was like a vice. "Mother, for God's sake, what are you doing?" Julian's voice was a whip crack. "Let the girl go. You are making a scene." He started to rise, his tall, imposing frame casting a long shadow. But as his gaze shifted from his mother's frantic, tear-filled face to the waitress's shocked one, something inside him fractured. For the first time, he wasn't just looking at a server, he was seeing her. He saw the eyes. He saw the defiant spark his mother had recognized. He saw the shape of the face, a familiar echo across the years, and a memory he had locked in a lead-lined vault in the deepest recess of his mind broke free. It was a memory of his younger sister Lillian, standing on the lawn of their summer home, her hazel eyes blazing with a fire he could never extinguish, an argument raging between them. The blood drained from his face, leaving behind a waxy gray pallor. The walls he had built around his heart, stone by meticulous stone over 22 years, didn't just crumble, they detonated. The past was not dead. It wasn't even past. It was standing 2 feet away from him, wearing a waitress's uniform and a look of terrified confusion. "Lillian," he echoed his mother's whisper, but his was laced with a different, more poisonous emotion. Not hope, but a suffocating, bottomless dread. His breath hitched. A sharp, searing pain shot through his chest and his hand flew to his tie, clawing at the knot as if he were being strangled. The room began to tilt, the edges of his vision dissolving into a swirling vortex of black. The last thing he saw before the darkness consumed him was Clara's face, a mirror of his lost sister, her eyes wide with a fear that mirrored his own. With a strangled gasp, Julian Montgomery, the unbreakable titan of industry, collapsed. He fell not like a man, but like a building being demolished, his body folding in on itself, sending a cascade of crystal, silver, and fine bone china crashing to the polished floor. The restaurant exploded into a symphony of screams and chaos. Eleanor shrieked her son's name, and Clara Mayhew stood perfectly still, her wrists still trapped in the old woman's iron grip, her quiet, ordered life shattered into a million unrecognizable shards. The aftermath was a blur of organized panic. Paramedics, summoned with the speed and efficiency that money commands, descended on the Onyx Room, their movements a stark contrast to the stunned paralysis of the patrons. They worked on Julian Montgomery with a focused intensity, shouting terms like acute coronary event and severe shock, words that meant nothing to Clara. She was finally released from Eleanor's grasp, stumbling back against an empty table, her mind a blank slate of disbelief. A man in a flawlessly tailored gray suit, who seemed to materialize out of the chaos, gently but firmly guided Eleanor away. He spoke to her in low, reassuring tones, but the old woman's eyes remained locked on Clara, a burning, questioning gaze that felt like a physical weight. Clara was no longer invisible. She was the epicenter of a tremor she couldn't understand, the unwilling star of a drama whose script she had never read. The police arrived, asking questions she couldn't answer. Then the man in the gray suit returned. He introduced himself as David Chen, general counsel for Montgomery Holdings. He had kind, intelligent eyes that seemed to miss nothing, and a calm demeanor that was more intimidating than any overt display of power. He asked her the same questions as the police, but his were more pointed. Name, age, place of birth. He took her details, handed her a heavy cardstock business card, and told her in a tone that brooked no argument, "Do not speak to anyone about this. We will be in touch." It was a command, not a suggestion. Sent home for the day, Clara walked through the Boston streets in a daze. Her small apartment, usually her sanctuary, felt alien. She shared the space with her friend Maya, a pragmatic nursing student who paid her share of the rent with a level head and a brutal honesty that kept Clara grounded. Maya found her on their worn-out sofa, staring at a water stain on the ceiling. "Clara, the manager called, said there was a medical emergency. You look like you just saw the apocalypse. What the hell happened?" Clara recounted the story in a monotone, the words feeling like they belonged to someone else. The elegant old woman, the cold billionaire, the grip, the impossible phrase, the collapse. Maya listened, her expression shifting from curiosity to wide-eyed disbelief. "Whoa, you have my daughter's eyes? That's intense. And the guy just dropped? Are you okay? That's terrifying." "It was unreal," Clara whispered, rubbing the wrist Eleanor had gripped. "The way she looked at me, Maya. It wasn't like she was just seeing a resemblance. It was like she was looking straight through my soul and seeing someone else standing there. And her son, he looked at me like I was a loaded gun." The next 48 hours were a masterclass in controlled information. The Montgomery PR machine went into overdrive. The official story was that Julian Montgomery had suffered a minor cardiac event due to overwork. But whispers slithered through the city's elite circles, a mysterious waitress, a bizarre confrontation. The call from David Chen came on the second day. He requested a meeting, not at his downtown office, but at a discreet private residence on Beacon Hill owned by the Montgomery family. Maya was instantly suspicious. "This feels like you're being summoned to the King's Court, Clara. Be careful." Clara went, dressed in her nicest, most unassuming clothes. The house was a museum of quiet wealth, filled with antique furniture and priceless art. Eleanor Montgomery was waiting for her in a sun-drenched sitting room. She looked smaller, more fragile than she had in the restaurant, the formidable matriarch replaced by a woman consumed by a grief so profound it seemed to suck the very air from the room. "Miss Mayhew," Eleanor began, her voice a delicate, papery thing. "Thank you for coming. My son, Julian, is stable. The doctors say the physical event was triggered by an extreme emotional shock." She paused, her pale blue eyes finding Clara's. "You were the shock, my dear." Clara swallowed, her throat dry. "I am so terribly sorry about your son, Mrs. Montgomery, but I truly don't understand any of this." 22 years ago, Eleanor said, her voice dropping, "I lost my daughter, Lillian. She was 21. Brilliant, defiant, so full of life she practically vibrated." A shadow of pain crossed her face. She was at odds with the family, with her father and with Julian. They disapproved of her activism, of the man she was seeing. One night, after a terrible argument with Julian, she packed a bag and she walked out. We never saw her again. The story was public knowledge, a faded headline from a bygone era, but hearing it from this woman made it visceral, immediate. "We hired the best investigators in the world," Eleanor continued. "We followed every lead, chased every ghost. After 5 years, the police declared her legally dead, but I never accepted it. A mother knows. I never felt her leave this world." Her gaze intensified, the fire returning. "When I saw you, it wasn't just your eyes. It's the way you hold your head. It's the shape of your face. You are the living image of my Lillian." Clara felt a wave of dizziness. "Mrs. Montgomery, with all due respect, this has to be a coincidence. I was born in Western Massachusetts. I was a foster child. I don't know who my birth parents were, The official story was that I was abandoned at a hospital. David Chen, who had been standing silently by the fireplace, stepped forward. We took the liberty of looking into your background, Miss Mayhew. What you say is true. You were a foundling, left at Berkshire Medical Center when you were approximately 1 week old. There was no note, no identification. Your history begins there. The air grew thick with unspoken possibilities. We believe, Eleanor said, her voice trembling with the sheer weight of the words, that Lillian was pregnant when she left. We believe you might be her child. The room spun. This was a fairy tale, a fantasy woven by a grieving mother desperate for a miracle. That is impossible, Clara stammered. Is it? Chen interjected smoothly. Or is it the only explanation that makes sense? He looked from Eleanor's pleading face to Clara's stunned one. Mrs. Montgomery needs to know. And frankly, after what happened to Julian, we all need to understand what's going on. Eleanor rose and slowly walked towards Clara. She stopped just short of touching her. I am an old woman, Miss Mayhew. I have lived in a gray world for 22 years. Seeing you was the first time I have seen color since my daughter left. Please. The desperation in her voice was a physical blow. We are asking you to consent to a DNA test. Clara looked into her eyes and saw not a billionaire matriarch, but a mother begging for an answer. We understand this is an incredible intrusion, Chen said, his tone shifting to business, and we are prepared to compensate you for it. We will establish a trust for you in the amount of $250,000. It is yours to keep regardless of the outcome of the test, a gesture of our gratitude for your cooperation and an apology for this disruption. $250,000. The number was abstract, astronomical. It was a lifetime of security. It was freedom from the gnawing anxiety of rent and bills. It was a new life. And if, Clara heard herself say, her voice a dry whisper, if it's a match, Eleanor answered, a single tear tracing a path down her powdered cheek. If you are my granddaughter, she said, her voice thick with emotion, then you have come home. It was a gilded key to a life she couldn't imagine, and an answer to the question that formed the hollow core of her existence. Where did I come from? But as she looked at the immense, oppressive luxury of the room, she felt a profound sense of dread. This wasn't just a family, it was an institution, an empire. To be a part of it wasn't just to find a home, it was to be consumed. I need some time to think, she managed. Of course, Chen said. He handed her another card, this one with a private number. Take 48 hours. The offer stands. Clara walked out of the Beacon Hill mansion and back into the familiar world of cracked sidewalks and noisy traffic, feeling as though she had just returned from a journey to a foreign star. In her pocket, she held a key. She just didn't know if it opened the door to a palace or a prison. The next 2 days were a sleepless fugue state. The number, $250,000, sat in Clara's mind, a glowing, impossible figure. It's life-changing money, Clara, Maya argued, pacing their small living room. You could go to college, get a degree in archival studies, open your own restoration studio. You'd never have to serve another overcooked fillet to some pompous jerk again. It's not about the money, Maya, Clara countered, though the allure was a potent, undeniable pull. What if it's true? My entire life, my identity, is built on being a blank slate. What if that slate gets filled in, and I don't like what's written on it? Or what if it's the most beautiful story you've ever read? Maya said gently. You've always wondered. Maybe this is your chance to know. The desire to know, the deep primal need for an origin story, was what ultimately tipped the scales. With a trembling hand, she called David Chen and agreed. The DNA collection was a sterile, discreet affair at a private clinic. A doctor took a swab from Clara's cheek and another from a tearfully hopeful Eleanor. The samples were coded, sealed, and sent via courier to a specialized lab in another state. The results would take a week. During that week, Clara's world was suspended. The money, as promised, appeared in a newly created bank account. Staring at the balance on her banking app felt like looking at a phone number. It wasn't real. True to their word, David Chen had arranged an indefinite leave of absence for her from the Onyx room, complete with full pay. The Montgomerys wanted her out of the public eye. Eleanor invited her to the family estate in Brookline, a sprawling stone mansion that resembled a small university campus. This time Julian was there. He had been discharged from the hospital looking thinner and grayer. He stood by a massive window overlooking acres of manicured lawn, his posture rigid. He didn't greet Clara. He simply watched her, his expression a complex mixture of suspicion, fear, and something else she couldn't name. "Julian," Eleanor said, her voice carrying a note of warning. "I simply want to be clear," Julian said, his voice low and strained, not looking at Clara, but at her reflection in the glass. "My mother is operating on hope. I am operating on the assumption that you are a remarkably clever opportunist until proven otherwise. Do not mistake her kindness for my credulity." "Julian!" Eleanor gasped, horrified. "I'm sorry," Clara said, her voice quiet but firm, surprising herself. "I'm sorry that I look like your sister. I'm sorry for whatever pain that has caused you, but I didn't ask for any of this. To be clear, Mr. Montgomery, I am here for your mother. Your credulity means nothing to me." For the first time, Julian turned and looked at her directly. A flicker of surprise, perhaps even respect, crossed his face before the mask of cold control snapped back into place. Eleanor, attempting to smooth over the tension, led Clara to the library. The room was a cathedral of books, but one wall was dominated by a single massive oil painting. It was of a young woman, no older than Clara, perched on the arm of a chair. She had the same chestnut hair, the same jawline, the same stubborn set to her mouth, and her eyes. They were Clara's eyes, but they were incandescent, blazing with a rebellious, untamable fire. "That's my Lillian," Eleanor whispered. Over the next hour, she brought her daughter to life, not as a tragic figure, but as a vibrant, difficult, passionate person. Lillian was a firebrand who clashed with her conservative father and her pragmatic, business-minded older brother. She protested the very corporations her family invested in. She fell in love with a penniless musician, a relationship that had caused the final, explosive rift. Julian. He saw her as a threat to the family's stability, to our name, Eleanor explained sadly. He called her lover a parasite. The things they said to each other that last night. Lillian screamed that she would rather be free and poor than live in this gilded prison. She said she was leaving and never coming back. We thought it was just youthful drama. We thought she'd call. Her voice broke. She never did. As Clara listened, a strange sense of connection to this fiery, defiant ghost began to form. She felt a flicker of that same spirit within herself. The quiet rebellion of choosing a life of dusty books over one of prescribed success. Before Clara left, Eleanor pressed a small, worn, leather-bound journal into her hands. This was hers, her diary. Perhaps it will help you understand her. Back in her apartment, Clara opened the journal. The pages were filled with Lillian's elegant, slanted script, poetry, angry tirades, passionate declarations. Tucked into a pocket at the back was a small, creased photograph. It showed Lillian, smiling, standing next to a tall, handsome man with intense eyes and a sharp suit. He wasn't the penniless musician. On the back, in Lillian's handwriting, was a single name, Thompson. Clara felt a prickle of unease. There was something in the man's smile that was more predatory than charming. Using her laptop, she did a quick search. The name was instantly recognizable. Arthur Thompson was now Senator Arthur Thompson, a charismatic and powerful politician with a squeaky clean public image and a reputation for ruthless efficiency. According to the old society pages, he and Lillian Davenport had been briefly intensely involved in the months before she disappeared. The relationship had ended abruptly. As Clara stared at the photo, a new unsettling feeling began to take root. This wasn't just a family tragedy about a girl who ran away with a musician. This was something darker, more complicated. The feeling intensified the next day. A black SUV was parked across the street from her building all morning. When she left to get groceries, it pulled away and followed her at a distance. Paranoia, she told herself. But then her apartment was broken into. Maya came home to find the door lock jimmied. Nothing was stolen. Not the laptops, not the TV, not the cash Maya had left on the counter. The only thing that had been disturbed was Clara's small workstation. Her restoration tools were scattered, and a box containing the few items she had from her infancy, a faded hospital blanket, her intake paperwork, had been rifled through. It wasn't a robbery, it was a search. Someone was looking for something. Shaken, Clara called David Chen. His reaction was immediate and serious. "Pack a bag. A car will be there in 20 minutes. You're moving into a suite at the Copley Grand. We'll have security on your floor." "But what about Lillian's journal?" Clara asked, her voice trembling. "It's the only thing they might have missed." "Bring it," Chen said grimly. "Someone knows who you are, Clara, and they are just as interested in the answer as we are." The day the DNA results were due, the tension in the hotel suite was thick enough to taste. Eleanor and a stone-faced Julian were there. David Chen stood by the window, his phone to his ear, listening. Clara just sat, her hands clutching Lillian's journal. She had spent the last 2 days poring over it. Much of it was mundane, but the last few entries were different. They were frantic, paranoid. "He knows. He won't let me go. AT is not who they think he is. He says I'll just disappear." Chen hung up the phone. He turned to face them, his expression unreadable. He took a deep breath. "The lab has confirmed the results," he said, his gaze finding Clara's. "The probability of maternity, based on the direct mitochondrial DNA link to Mrs. Montgomery, is 99.9999%. He paused, letting the clinical words land with the force of a physical blow. "Clara Mayhew," he declared, his voice formal. "You are the daughter of Lillian Montgomery." A strangled sob broke from Eleanor as she stumbled forward, her arms open. Julian stood frozen, his face ashen, the last of his skepticism incinerated by the terrible, irrefutable truth. But Clara barely heard them. Her mind was racing, connecting the dots. Lillian hadn't run away from her family. She had been running from him, from Arthur Thompson, the break-in, the surveillance. It wasn't the Montgomerys. It was Thompson, terrified that the ghost of a 22-year-old secret was about to come back and destroy his carefully constructed life. Her appearance hadn't just reopened a family wound. It had poked a sleeping dragon. She looked at Julian, seeing the flicker of dawning horror in his eyes as he, too, began to understand. "It wasn't just about a musician, was it?" she asked, her voice steady, clear, and filled with a cold dread. She was afraid of someone powerful. Finding her family was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of a war, and the enemy was a man who had already made one Montgomery disappear. The confirmation of Clara's identity acted like a detonator within the Montgomery family. The sterile quiet of the hotel suite was replaced by the frantic energy of a war room. Julian, his initial shock and suspicion burned away by a new, galvanizing fear for Clara's safety, transformed. The cold, distant Titan became a fiercely protective strategist. "He knows," Julian said, pacing the length of the suite, his voice tight with fury. "Thompson, all these years I assumed she just left. But if he's the reason she ran, and now he knows she had a child..." The implication hung in the air, heavy and lethal. He turned to Clara, his eyes boring into hers. "That journal, what does it say?" Clara opened it to the last frantic entries. "She writes that he was obsessed, that he wouldn't accept their breakup. But it's more than that. She says she found something. His whole empire is built on a lie. The Pine Ridge Project. It's all poison. She mentions a ledger. She says she has a copy. The Pine Ridge Project." Julian stopped pacing, a dark look of recognition on his face. My God, that was Thompson's first major real estate development upstate. It made his career, launched his political path. There were rumors at the time, whispers of corners cut, environmental regulations ignored. But his father was a judge. It all got swept under the rug. Lillian must have found proof, David Chen surmised, his legal mind whirring, if she threatened to expose him and then vanished. He didn't just scare her away, Julian finished, his voice grim. He silenced her. The hunt for the truth began in earnest. Julian unleashed the full, terrifying power of his resources. He hired a discreet team of forensic investigators, former intelligence operatives who could peel back the layers of a man's life without leaving a single fingerprint. Their target, Senator Arthur Thompson. While they dug into Thompson's finances and political dealings, Clara focused on Lillian's life. With Eleanor, she went through boxes of her mother's belongings, which had been perfectly preserved in a climate-controlled room at the estate. Amid sketchbooks, concert tickets, and protest flyers, Clara found a small, unassuming box of negatives and undeveloped film rolls. She was taking a photography class at the university, Eleanor recalled softly. She was always taking pictures of everything. Clara took the box. This was her territory. In the quiet of her hotel suite, she set up a makeshift darkroom. As she carefully developed the film, an image slowly emerged from the chemical bath. It was a photograph of a document, a single page from a ledger. The columns detailed payments, coded as consulting fees and mitigation expenses, paid to shell corporations. At the bottom of the page was a signature, A. Thompson. But there was something else. The photo was slightly blurry, taken in haste. Using the digital scanner and software she normally used for restoring antique photographs, Clara began to painstakingly clean up the image, sharpening the focus pixel by pixel. And then she saw it. In the background of the shot, barely visible behind the ledger, was a reflection in a polished desk lamp. It was a distorted image of Lillian's face, her expression terrified. And next to her, another reflection, a man's hand wearing a very distinctive gold signet ring engraved with a stylized T. She remembered the photo from the journal. Arthur Thompson wore that ring. This photograph didn't just show the evidence. It placed Thompson in the room with Lillian when she took it. It was the missing link. Her heart pounded as she worked on another roll of film. This one contained photos not of documents, but of a place. A small rustic motel by a lake, the sign reading, "The Warbler's Nest." There were photos of the room, the woods behind it. It was where Lillian had been hiding. The investigators, armed with the world once a spinning vortex of chaos, did not slow down. It fractured. The confirmation of Clara's identity was not a key turning in a lock, but a demolition charge set at the base of 3 lives. In the hushed, sterile air of the hotel suite, the 99.999% probability hung like suspended dust in a sunbeam, illuminating everything with a terrible, beautiful clarity. Eleanor's sob was the sound of a 22-year-old dam breaking. She did not rush to Clara, but crumpled, her grief too heavy to carry across the room. It was Julian who moved first. The ice in his veins, the permafrost that had encased his heart since his sister's disappearance, did not melt. It shattered. He looked at Clara, truly looked at her, and for the first time, he did not see a ghost or a threat. He saw the flesh and blood consequence of his own youthful, arrogant fury. The argument, the final, venomous words he had spat at Lillian. They were not just the end of a chapter. They were the prologue to this very moment. A profound, seismic guilt, deeper than any corporate loss he had ever weathered, threatened to pull him under. But it was Clara who grounded them. She held the small, cold weight of her mother's locket in her palm. The microfilm was the truth, but it was an incomplete truth. It was the what, not the why or the how. Her mind, trained to see the stories in faded ink and brittle paper, looked past the immediate threat of Arthur Thompson and toward the narrative he had tried to erase. "He isn't just running," she said, her voice cutting through Eleanor's weeping and Julian's stunned silence. Her tone was not that of a victim, but of a historian on the verge of a discovery. "And he isn't just hunting, he's curating. For 22 years, he has meticulously curated a story of his own success, built on my mother's grave. He won't risk a messy, violent confrontation. That's not his style. He'll try to discredit the source. He'll try to erase me, not by making me disappear, but by making me a lie." Julian's focus sharpened, the CEO superseding the grieving brother. "He'll paint you as a fraud, an opportunist who somehow faked a DNA test. He'll use his political machine to bury us in litigation and slander until the truth is irrelevant." "Exactly," Clara affirmed. "We can't fight him in the shadows. That's his territory. We have to bring him into the light. My light." She looked down at her hands, the hands of a restorer. "He thinks my mother's story is a ruin, but I know how to bring ruins back to life." The plan that bloomed was not one of tactical force, but of narrative warfare. It was quiet, meticulous, and devastatingly elegant. It began not with a phone call to the police, but with a press release from Montgomery Holdings. Eleanor Montgomery, after 2 decades of seclusion, was announcing the formation of the Lillian Montgomery Foundation for the Arts, dedicated to supporting emerging female artists. The inaugural event would be a charity gala and auction held in just 1 week at the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. The centerpiece of the evening would be the unveiling of a lost collection of Lillian's early photography, recently discovered and painstakingly restored. It was an invitation that Senator Arthur Thompson, a public patron of the arts, and a man who had often spoken of his brief but fond, youthful acquaintance with the tragic Lillian Montgomery, could not possibly refuse. To decline would be an admission of something being wrong. He would have to attend, to stand on that polished museum floor, smiling for the cameras, a pillar of civic virtue. He would walk willingly into their trap, convinced it was his stage. The week was a blur of controlled frenzy. While Julian's security team shadowed Maya, moving her to a secure, undisclosed location, and his legal team prepared an airtight case based on the microfilm, Clara and Eleanor immersed themselves in Lillian's world. They worked not in a war room, but in the sun-drenched library of the Brookline estate. The boxes of Lillian's belongings became an archaeological dig site. Clara found her mother in the margins of books, in the angry, passionate scrawls of her journals, and most of all, in the contact sheets of her photographs. Lillian hadn't just been taking pictures of ledgers. She had been creating a visual diary of her fear. There were clandestine shots of Thompson's car, of his fixer lingering near her apartment, of the view from the window of the warbler's nest. But it was the last roll of film, the one Clara had painstakingly developed, that held the key. It contained a series of self-portraits. In them, Lillian was not the vibrant, defiant girl from the oil painting, but a haunted, pale young woman. She was in a bare, sterile-looking room, the motel room. In each frame, she held up a different object, a page from the ledger, a child's rattle, a single, perfect white gardenia. The final shot was of her own reflection in a dark window pane. Her face was half in shadow, but her eyes, those fierce, familiar hazel eyes, stared directly into the lens. And behind her, ghostly and faint but undeniably present, was the reflection of a man entering the room. The glint of light off his signet ring was unmistakable. It was a confession in silver gelatin, a story told in 4 frames. It was Lillian's final, desperate message in a bottle. She knew, Eleanor whispered, tears tracing paths through her makeup as she looked at the prints laid out on the mahogany table. She knew he was coming for her, and she used her last moments to bear witness. Clara felt a profound, aching connection to the mother she had never known. This was not just evidence. This was art. This was Lillian's soul, captured and preserved. "We won't just show the evidence," Clara said, her voice resonating with a newfound authority. "We will exhibit her testimony." The night of the gala, the museum hummed with the electric energy of Boston's elite. Crystal glasses chinked, and low murmurs of gossip and commerce filled the vast, vaulted hall. Julian stood beside Clara, a silent, imposing guardian in a flawless tuxedo. He had shed the look of a predator and now wore the grim focus of a protector. He had learned the painful lesson that true control was not about dominating the boardroom, but about creating a space where the truth could be safely told. Eleanor moved through the crowd, a queen returned from exile, her grief transformed into a regal, unassailable strength. Senator Thompson arrived, his smile as polished as his shoes. He radiated charm, shaking hands, kissing cheeks, a man utterly at home in the spotlight. He approached their small family circle, his eyes so full of practiced sincerity, landing on Clara. "My dear," he said, his voice a smooth, deep purr of condescension. "You are the living image of your mother, a startling resemblance. Eleanor, Julian, my deepest condolences on reopening such old wounds, but what a beautiful tribute this foundation is." It was a masterclass in public deflection, an attempt to frame them as grieving figures, and himself as the compassionate statesman. "The past is never truly gone, Arthur," Eleanor replied, her voice as cool and clear as ice water. "Sometimes it just waits to be restored." The presentation began. The lights dimmed. A massive screen descended behind the stage. Clara walked to the podium, her heart not pounding with fear, but beating with a slow, steady rhythm of purpose. She did not feel like an imposter. She felt like a conduit. "Good evening," she began, her voice steady, carrying through the silent hall. "We are here tonight to celebrate the legacy of my mother, Lillian Montgomery. Most people remember the story of her disappearance, but tonight we want to remember the story of her life, through her art." She spoke of Lillian's passion, her fire, her refusal to be silenced. Then she turned to the screen. "Towards the end of her life, my mother was working on a final, deeply personal project, a photo series she never had the chance to name. We have called it Witness." The first image appeared on the screen, vast and undeniable. Lillian's haunted face holding the ledger page. A collective gasp rippled through the audience. Clara's voice was the calm center of the storm as she walked them through the sequence. The rattle, the gardenia. Each image a new piece of a story that was becoming horrifyingly clear. Thompson stood frozen in the crowd, his smile gone, his face a mask of disbelief. This was not what he had expected. He had prepared for a direct accusation, something his lawyers could swat away. He was not prepared for this art exhibit, this public autopsy of his crime. Then the final photograph filled the screen. Lillian's reflection, her eyes boring out at the audience of 1,000 people, and behind her, the ghostly image of her killer, his ring glinting like a malevolent star. "My mother was not a victim," Clara said, her voice ringing with the conviction of absolute truth. "She was a witness to fraud, to corruption, to intimidation." She paused, her eyes finding Thompson's in the crowd, pinning him in a spotlight of his own making. "And to the man who took her life because he could not bear the thought of her telling the truth." Her final act on this earth was to create this, to leave behind a testimony that could not be refuted. She knew that one day someone would find it, someone would understand it, someone would show it to the world. She stepped back from the podium. The silence in the hall was absolute, a crushing weight of comprehension. Every eye was on Arthur Thompson. The flashes of cameras began, not the polite pops of society photographers, but the percussive, predatory blasts of a press corps that smelled blood. His carefully constructed world, his entire life's narrative, had been dismantled in 4 black and white photographs. He did not run. He could not. He simply stood there as the truth, Lillian's truth, stripped him bare. In the months that followed, the architecture of their lives was rebuilt, not on the old fractured foundations, but on new, solid ground. Arthur Thompson's confession was a mere formality, a footnote to the public execution by photograph. The real work was in the quiet spaces, in the moments after the storm had passed. Clara did not move into the Brookline estate. Instead, with a small portion of the fortune that was now hers, she bought a 3-story brownstone in the South End. The top floor was her apartment, filled with light and the scent of books. The bottom 2 floors became the permanent home of the Lillian Project. It was not the global foundation for whistleblowers Julian had envisioned, but something more intimate, more her. It was a pro bono archival and restoration studio for families, journalists, and advocacy groups who needed to preserve and understand fragile histories. The letters of forgotten activists, the photographs of silenced communities, the records of corporate malfeasance. She was not just finishing her mother's work, she was honoring her own. She was a restorer of truths. Julian found his penance not in a grand gesture, but in the daily act of showing up. He would visit the brownstone, not as a board member, but as a brother. He would sit in a worn armchair in her studio, the smell of fixative and archival paper replacing the sterile air of his office, and he would simply listen. He listened as she told him about the family photos she was restoring for a woman whose home had burned down. He listened as she explained the chemical process for halting the decay of a 19th century manuscript. In listening, he was learning a new language, not of acquisitions and mergers, but of preservation and care. One crisp autumn afternoon, a year to the day after he had collapsed in the Onyx Room, He found her hunched over a light table, examining a negative. "I was wrong," he said, the words costing him more than any billion-dollar deal. "That last night with Lillian, I told her she was destroying the family. I thought protecting the family meant controlling the narrative, burying the problems. I thought strength was a fortress." He looked around the quiet sunlit studio, at the patient, meticulous work of saving small, important things. Strength isn't a fortress. It's a workshop. It's taking what's broken and having the patience to make it whole again. "You're the strongest one of us all, Clara." Just like she was. Eleanor found her peace not in forgetting, but in remembering correctly. The ghost of Lillian, the perfect, tragic daughter she had kept enshrined in a glass box of grief, was finally allowed to rest. In its place was the memory of the real Lillian, fiery, difficult, brilliant, and brave. She spent her afternoons at the brownstone, not as a wealthy patron, but as a grandmother. She would help Clara sort through old documents, her elegant fingers, once laden with diamonds, now carefully handling brittle paper. She told Clara stories, not of the socialite, but of the little girl who loved to climb trees, the teenager who argued about politics at the dinner table, the young woman who loved with a ferocious, all-consuming passion. Grief was no longer a tomb, it was a garden, and in it, these stories bloomed. One evening, Clara was working late, restoring the final photograph from Lillian's Witness series. It was the master print, the one they had used for the gala. As she carefully cleaned the surface, she looked at her own reflection superimposed over her mother's in the glass of the frame. For a year, she had worn her mother's eyes, her mother's face, her mother's name. She had carried the weight of her mother's story and had seen it through to its conclusion. But now, looking at the two faces, one an echo of the other across time, she saw the difference. Lillian's eyes were defiant, burning with the fire of a battle she was about to lose. Clara's eyes were calm. They held the quiet strength of a war already won. She was not just a blank slate that had been filled in. She was not just a continuation of a story that had been interrupted. She was her own story, forged in silence, honed by patience, and finally brought into the light. The quiet rhythms of her old life were gone, replaced by a purpose that resonated deep in her soul. She picked up a fine-tipped brush, dipped it in a restoring solution, and with a steady hand, she began her work. She was Clara Lillian Montgomery, and she was home.